whether you're eating, studying, driving, hitting the gym, or just killing time. If you want to think deeper, question more, and actually understand the world, subscribe to the History Trending podcast.
So if you are listening to this right now, I want you to picture a scene. It is the summer of 325 AD. And you have this group of men walking into a lavish Roman imperial palace. But these aren't your typical politicians or wealthy elites.
No, not at all.
These men have recently been mutilated, like literally tortured by the Roman government, but they aren't walking into this palace to be executed.
Right, which is what you would expect.
Exactly. They're there at the direct request of the emperor himself to vote on the exact nature of God. And the single non-biblical word that they end up choosing to settle this debate, it would fundamentally alter the course of Western civilization.
I mean, it is arguably the most dramatic psychological whiplash in ancient history. You have these individuals who are bearing the literal physical scars of systemic state violence.
Yeah, we're talking gouged eyes, hamstrung legs.
Exactly. And suddenly they're walking on marble floors, and they're flanked by the very imperial guards who maybe just a decade earlier might have been ordered to kill them.
It's completely wild to think about.
It really is. And they are there to engage in this highly technical, deeply philosophical debate about the very fabric of reality itself.
Well, welcome to this deep dive into one of the most profoundly misunderstood, mythologized, and utterly pivotal moments in world history. We are talking about the Council of Nicaea.
Yes, the big one.
And we have an extensive stack of sources for you today. We've got historical analyses from late antiquity scholars, detailed theological breakdowns of early Christian philosophy.
Which gets very complicated, but we'll break it down.
We definitely will. We also have transcripts exploring the political machinery of the Roman Empire, and even some primary source excerpts from a man named Eusebius, who was a contemporary bishop actually in the room at the time.
He's a fascinating figure to look at.
Oh, for sure. So our mission today is to separate the gritty historical reality from all the pop culture conspiracy theories. But beyond that, we are exploring a really provocative question for you to think about. What actually happens when a persecuted underground faith is suddenly protected, adopted, and shaped by the supreme political power of the world?
Right, because that collision between absolute political power and deeply held spiritual belief, it creates a shockwave that we are, frankly, still feeling today. When a faith is forged in the margins, it behaves one way. But when it's suddenly handed the keys to the empire, its entire DNA is forced to adapt.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the absolute chaos of Nicaea, we can't just start right in the imperial palace.
No, context is everything here.
It is. We have to rewind to the decades before the Roman state got involved. And looking through our historical analyses, there is a recurring theme that totally shatters the popular conception of early Christianity.
Yeah, the pervasive assumption that people have is that early Christianity operated as a monolith.
Right, like one big unified church.
Exactly. A sort of pristine institution quietly humming along, passing down this single, universally accepted set of doctrines straight from the apostles to the 4th century, and just, occasionally swatting away rogue heretics.
But the reality is way messier than that.
It is far more complex and decentralized. In fact, one of the scholars in our sources uses a brilliant term for it. They call it a supernova of Jesus movements.
A supernova. I want to visualize that for a second. It's like this explosion of diverse ideas, texts, and interpretations just expanding rapidly outward across the Mediterranean. But looking at the sources, this wasn't just, a geographical spread. It was a massive philosophical fragmentation.
Precisely. You have different regions developing vastly different theological ecosystems. So, for example, the church in Alexandria, which is steeped in Greek Neoplatonism, approaches Scripture with a highly allegorical philosophical lens.
Right.
Meanwhile, the church in Antioch leans toward a much more literal Aristotelian interpretation. And then Rome has its own distinct administrative and practical focus.
So there was no central boss, no overarching legal authority forcing all these regional hubs to perfectly align their definitions of the divine?
No, not at all.
I was actually trying to map this onto a modern equivalent, and it kind of reminds me of an underground indie music scene that hasn't been commercialized yet.
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, so imagine you have all these distinct garage bands scattered across different cities, and they're playing completely different genres. Some are punk, some are acoustic, some are highly experimental noise rock.
Right, right.
But they are all independently calling themselves rock and roll. They share a common root inspiration, but if you put them in a room together, they wouldn't even know how to tune to the same key.
Because they've been operating entirely independently.
Exactly. And there is no major record label to step in, smooth out their rough edges, and force them into a standardized marketable genre. They are just creating and surviving out in the margins.
That analogy actually holds up really well, especially when you consider the stakes of their marginalization. In the case of early Christians, the local authorities weren't just ignoring the underground scene.
They were actively burning down the venues.
Literally. For the first 3 centuries, Christianity was a legally precarious, frequently persecuted movement, and that decentralized supernova structure. It wasn't just a byproduct of their early expansion.
Right.
It was a vital survival mechanism.
Wait, so you're telling me the lack of a central, unified doctrine was actually a feature, not a bug, of being persecuted?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the mechanics of the Roman persecutions, particularly the severe waves under the Emperor Diocletian. This is just prior to the early 300s.
And those were brutal, right?
Incredibly brutal. Diocletian orchestrated a systemic, empire-wide attempt to just eradicate the movement. Churches were leveled, texts were systematically burned, and leadership was heavily targeted for execution or torture.
So in that kind of environment, you physically cannot hold a massive intercontinental summit to standardize your theology.
Exactly. If holding a small gathering in a basement could get you thrown to the beasts in the arena, a worldwide council is a logistical impossibility.
Right.
So theology develops locally, organically, and diversely.
Which makes the sudden shift in the 4th century so incredibly jarring. We move from this decentralized, persecuted underground to the supreme authority of the Roman emperor essentially buying out the indie record label.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the rise of Constantine doesn't just change the political map. It fundamentally alters the trajectory of human thought.
So set the stage for Constantine for us.
Well, by 312 AD, Constantine is fighting a brutal civil war for control of a fractured Roman Empire. And he famously attributes his military victory at the Milvian Bridge to the Christian god.
And then comes the big turning point.
Right. In 313 AD, he and his co-emperor Licinius issue the Edict of Milan, which officially legalizes the religion.
Now, I've read some of the primary source material from Eusebius on this, and it is honestly wild to see the sheer level of sycophancy here.
Oh, it's off the charts.
Yeah, Eusebius writes this glowing biography. It's called The Life of Constantine, and it just reads like pure imperial propaganda. He doesn't just praise Constantine as a good leader.
No, he elevates him.
He really does. He paints him as a divinely appointed savior, chosen directly by the supreme God to rescue the faithful from the savage beasts of persecution. Eusebius described Constantine inviting humble ministers to his imperial table and claiming the emperor saw, and this is a quote, not the man as seen by the vulgar eye, but the God in him.
Yeah, Eusebius is basically providing us with the blueprint for how the church began to reconcile with state power.
It's like a brand new political theology.
Exactly. Where the Roman emperor is a mirror of divine rule on earth, Eusebius frames Constantine not merely as a patron, but almost as a bishop of the empire himself.
Wow.
This is a man who rebuilds churches, funds the clergy, and even mints coins, showing himself gazing upward in divine contemplation. For a community that was so traumatized by centuries of state violence, Constantine is perceived as this messianic figure delivering a golden age.
I mean, I totally get the psychological relief they must have felt, but from a purely historical perspective, looking at the modern analyses in our stack, Constantine was a pragmatist.
Oh, 100%.
He was a military commander who had just conquered a deeply divided, fragile empire. He didn't suddenly become a theologian overnight.
He most certainly did not. Constantine recognized that the traditional Roman civic structures, and, the traditional pagan pantheon, they were no longer sufficient to hold his vast, diverse territories together.
They were losing their grip.
Right. But he observed the Christian network and saw something highly organized. Even under severe persecution, Christians maintained an impressive communication network. They cared for their sick, they cared for the poor of their cities, and they had a remarkably resilient internal hierarchy of bishops and deacons.
So Constantine looks at that network and basically sees ideological glue.
Yes. He believed that adopting and elevating this unified, highly motivated network could be the mortar to rebuild the foundations of the Roman state.
But that imperial backing comes with a massive inherent contradiction.
Which is?
The very empire that spent centuries throwing Christians to the lions to maintain Roman unity is now trying to use those exact same Christians to maintain Roman unity.
It is a massive irony.
And the fatal flaw in Constantine's political strategy is that his glue wasn't actually mixed yet.
Exactly. He wanted the church to unify his empire. But the church itself was not unified. Like we said, it was a supernova.
Right.
And right as Constantine is consolidating his absolute power, a local theological dispute in Egypt just detonates, threatening to fracture the entire eastern half of his empire.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the spark that lights this powder keg isn't a political rebellion or a debate over taxes. It's an abstract philosophical argument in the city of Alexandria.
It really comes out of nowhere, politically speaking.
Right. So we need to look at what was actually happening between Bishop Alexander and a popular local priest named Arius.
Well, Alexandria was the intellectual crown jewel of the ancient Mediterranean. It was an environment steeped deeply in Greek philosophy.
Especially that Neoplatonic tradition we mentioned.
Exactly, which heavily influenced how scholars there understood the nature of God. So in this highly charged academic atmosphere, a fierce dispute breaks out. Arius, who was a very charismatic and well-educated presbyter, begins openly clashing with his superior, Bishop Alexander.
I want to slow down here and really clarify what Arius was arguing, because he is constantly misrepresented today.
He really is.
If you look at pop history, people assume Arius was claiming that Jesus was just a regular guy, like a moral philosopher, maybe a mortal prophet, kind of similar to how modern secularism views him.
Right, that's the common trope.
But our sources make it abundantly clear that this is a complete misconception of the actual debate.
It is a vital distinction to make. Both sides of this debate, Arius included, firmly believed that Jesus Christ was divine.
Let's emphasize that. Arius thought Jesus was divine.
Yes, Arius believed Jesus was the Logos, the pre-existent Word of God, and magnificent entity through whom God the Father created the entire universe.
Okay.
But Arius drew a very sharp, uncompromising philosophical line based on the concept of causation.
He argued that if the Father begat the Son, which is the language used in the Scriptures, then the act of begetting inherently implies a beginning.
Yes. Arius's theological catchphrase, which ended up echoing all across the Mediterranean, was, "There was a time when the Son was not."
There was a time when the Son was not.
Right. He insisted that the Son was created out of nothing by the will of the Father. Therefore, no matter how glorious, how ancient, or how divine the Son is, he is fundamentally subordinate to the Father.
So he's the first and greatest of all creations, but he is still, at his core, a creation.
Exactly.
Wait, I'm confused. If Arius believed Jesus was a divine being who existed before the universe and actually created the universe, how is that practically different from what his opponent, Bishop Alexander, believed?
It sounds similar on the surface.
Yeah, to a layman, that just sounds like God making the world. Where is the actual friction here that causes an empire-wide meltdown?
Well, the friction lies in the Neoplatonic understanding of what makes God, God. For Arius, the ultimate supreme being, God the Father, must be absolutely eternal, unchangeable, and indivisible.
Okay, unchanging is the key word here.
Right. Because if God shares his core essence with another being, or if God's nature changes by suddenly generating a son from within his own substance, then God is no longer the perfect, unchangeable monad.
I see.
For Arius, to protect the absolute majesty and uniqueness of the Father, the Son must be a separate, created entity.
And Bishop Alexander, along with his fiery young deacon Athanasius, hears this logic and essentially views it as an existential threat to the entire Christian faith.
They absolutely do.
They argue that the Son is co-eternal with the Father, that there was never a single moment in eternity past where the Son did not exist.
Because, for Alexander and Athanasius, the mechanics of salvation are entirely dependent on the Son being fully uncreated God. This isn't just an abstract debate for them.
It has real-world spiritual stakes.
Right. In the Alexandrian theological tradition, salvation is understood as humanity being united with the divine. It's a process sometimes called theosis.
Theosis, okay.
So if Jesus is a created being, even the most exalted super angel in the cosmos, he is still just a creature. And a creature cannot bridge the infinite gap between humanity and the Creator.
Wow.
Only God himself, stepping into human history, possesses the ontological power to redeem and unite humanity with the divine nature.
So, if I'm tracking this, Athanasius is saying if you worship Jesus, but you believe Jesus is a creature, you are committing idolatry, because you can only worship the uncreated God.
That's his argument, yes.
And furthermore, a created Jesus can't actually save you.
Precisely. Athanasius argued that Arius wasn't just adjusting philosophical definitions, he was destroying the very engine of salvation.
That is heavy.
It is. But to be fair to the historical record, Arius looked at Alexander's position and saw equal destruction. Well, Arius believed that if you make the Son co-eternal and of the exact same substance as the Father, you are destroying the uniqueness of God and inching dangerously close to polytheism. Worshipping two gods.
And this is where the debate becomes a massive scriptural ping-pong match, because both sides are armed with specific verses to validate their philosophy.
Oh, they both have receipts.
Yeah, Arius points to the Gospel of John, where Jesus explicitly says, "The Father is greater than I," or to Paul's letters calling Jesus the firstborn of all creation.
While Alexander counters with verses like, "I and the Father are one," and the prologue of John, "The Word was God."
If Arius is using the text and Alexander is using the text, and both sides are using this highly sophisticated Greek logic to interpret that text, how do you resolve a debate where both factions are utterly convinced they possess the absolute uncompromised truth?
Well, historically, you write letters. You hold local synods. You argue it out over decades, maybe centuries.
Right, slowly.
But this specific debate didn't have the luxury of time because Arius was brilliant at public relations.
Wait, PR in the 4th century?
Yes. He didn't just write dense theological treatises. He reportedly set his theology to catchy rhythmic tunes, like sea shanties and traveling songs.
No way. Sea shanties about the nature of God.
Literally. Songs that merchants, sailors, and dock workers would sing as they traveled across the Mediterranean. He bypassed the academic elite entirely and took his theology straight to the streets.
Which means the supernova is expanding again, but this time it's happening right in front of the emperor.
And Constantine is not happy.
Constantine looks at the eastern half of his newly unified empire and sees massive protests, riots in the streets, and bishops excommunicating each other over the timeline of eternity.
From Constantine's perspective, as a military commander who values order and discipline, this is an incomprehensible, ridiculous distraction.
I can only imagine his frustration.
Our sources show that Constantine initially tried to handle this like a bureaucratic snag. He wrote letters to both Alexander and Arius, essentially ordering them to just drop the subject.
Like a manager telling 2 employees to work it out.
Exactly. He described it as a trivial, hyper-academic dispute over words that never should have been brought before the public. He demanded they forgive each other, shake hands, and restore the peace of the empire.
It perfectly illustrates how completely out of his depth Constantine was regarding the theology.
Totally out of his depth.
You can't just tell 2 deeply devout factions to agree to disagree on the fundamental molecular structure of the God they're dedicating their lives to. To Constantine, it's a zoning dispute. To them, it's a battle for the eternal soul of humanity.
And when his letters completely failed to quell the unrest, Constantine realized he had to escalate.
Right.
If local authorities couldn't resolve the issue, he would use the vast logistical machinery of the Roman state to force a resolution. He summoned the leadership of the Christian world to a grand, unprecedented assembly.
The first ecumenical or worldwide council in history.
Yes.
Which brings us to the year 325 AD and the city of Nicaea. Constantine doesn't just invite these bishops. He flexes the unbelievable wealth and power of the state to facilitate this.
He pulls out all the stops.
He opens up the Imperial Postal Service, which, by the way, was usually reserved strictly for high-level government and military transport just to ferry hundreds of bishops across the empire. He pays for their travel, their lodging, and he hosts them inside an imperial summer palace.
The historical accounts suggest somewhere over 300 bishops attended, predominantly from the Greek-speaking East. And this is where we must return to that profound psychological whiplash we talked about at the start.
I really want to emphasize the physical reality of the people in that room. The sources point out that many of these bishops were not soft academic bureaucrats.
No, they were survivors.
They were men known as confessors, meaning they had confessed their faith under the threat of death during the Diocletian persecutions just a decade or 2 prior.
It's hard to overstate the trauma.
There are specific accounts of men like Bishop Paphnutius of Upper Egypt, who had his right eye gouged out and the tendons in his left leg severed by Roman torturers simply because he refused to sacrifice to the pagan gods.
You also have Paul of Neo-Caesarea, whose hands were paralyzed because red-hot irons had been applied to them during his interrogation.
Just brutal.
These were men who had quite literally offered their bodies to be broken by the Roman state, rather than compromise one iota of their faith.
And now, those exact same men are limping through the towering marble columns of an imperial palace, Roman guards, wearing the same uniforms as the men who tortured them, are standing at attention.
It's surreal.
The emperor is throwing lavish banquets in their honor. There's a famous anecdote that Constantine himself walked among the bishops and respectfully kissed the empty, scarred eye socket of Paphnutius.
What's fascinating here is how this environment inherently transforms the mechanics of theological consensus.
How so?
Before Nicaea, as we discussed, disputes were settled organically, locally, often messily in the margins. Now, theology is being actively debated under the literal and metaphorical shadow of the Roman throne.
Right.
The emperor, draped in imperial purple, is sitting in the room, actively listening and occasionally interjecting.
Which forces a very uncomfortable question. Did the presence of the emperor naturally coerce the outcome?
It's the big debate among historians.
Like, could a bishop, even a hardened survivor like Paphnutius, truly speak his mind freely if he knew the most powerful military dictator on earth was sitting 10 feet away, glaring at him, just wanting everyone to shut up and sign a peace treaty?
It is the defining tension of the Council of Nicaea. The proceedings were actually presided over by Homoousios of Cordova, who was a trusted theological advisor to Constantine, which clearly signals imperial oversight. Arius himself was brought into the council. Now, because Arius was only a priest and not a bishop, he didn't have voting rights.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but he was commanded to explain his theology. His primary champion among the voting bishops was a man named Eusebius of Nicaea. And to be clear, this is a completely different person from Eusebius, the biographer we mentioned earlier.
Okay, two different Eusebiuses. Got it. I imagine stepping up to the microphone to defend Arius in a room full of hardened confessors was a pretty tense moment. How did the council react to his defense?
It was a total disaster for the Arian faction.
Really?
Oh, yeah. When Eusebius of Nicaea stood up and read a document that clearly and unapologetically laid out the logical extremes of Arian belief.
What did the document say?
It stated plainly that the Son was a created being, brought into existence from nothing, and of a fundamentally different substance than the Father. And the council reportedly erupted.
Wow.
The majority of the bishops were absolutely horrified. Accounts describe bishops shouting him down, literally stopping their ears so they wouldn't hear the blasphemy, and physically tearing the document to pieces right in front of him.
The stark, unvarnished formulation of the theology completely backfired.
Completely.
It forced the vast majority of the undecided or moderate bishops to realize just how radical the Arian position actually was.
Exactly. It became immediately clear to the Orthodox majority that they couldn't just issue some vague statement of unity to please the emperor.
They needed something concrete.
They needed to draft a definitive statement of faith, a creed, that specifically and surgically rejected Arius' teachings. They needed to draw an unbreakable line in the sand.
And this brings us to the drafting of the Nicene Creed. Not the exact long version recited in modern churches today, but the original 325 AD draft.
Right, the early version.
And as they're writing this, they run into a massive problem. They need a theological weapon. They need a word that Arius cannot possibly agree to.
This is a crucial point regarding how theology was codified here. The Orthodox bishops initially tried to use strictly biblical language to construct the creed.
Because that makes sense, right? Stick to the scriptures.
Right. They wanted to say the Son was the true power and image of the Father, always existing in him.
But every time they proposed a scriptural phrase, the Arian bishops would whisper to each other and agree to it. It's like watching a legal deposition where you're trying to trap a slippery witness.
That's a great way to describe it.
The Orthodox bishops would say, let's put down that the Son is the power of God. And Arius would say, sure, I can sign that. Even a created being can be imbued with the power of God.
The Arians were incredibly adept at reinterpreting Scripture to fit their Neoplatonic framework. They could agree to almost any biblical title for Jesus by just adding their own philosophical asterisk to it.
So the Orthodox bishops realize they have a catastrophic legal loophole on their hands.
Yes.
They realize that to protect their interpretation of the Bible, they have to completely abandon biblical vocabulary. They have to invent a non-biblical password just to lock Arius out.
Yes. They needed a term so specific, so philosophically dense, that it offered zero wiggle room for an Arian interpretation.
And what word did they find?
The word they ultimately settled on, which was allegedly suggested by Constantine himself, though likely prompted by his advisor Homoousios, was Homoousios.
Homoousios.
It is the Greek philosophical term that translates to of the same substance or of the same essence or consubstantial.
So they write into the creed that Jesus Christ is begotten, not made, being of one substance, Homoousios, with the Father.
And the irony of using this specific word is just staggering. Homoousios was not just absent from the Bible. It was a term deeply embedded in secular Greek philosophy.
That is wild.
But what makes it even more shocking is that roughly 60 years earlier, at a local church council in Antioch, the Orthodox Church had actively condemned the use of the word homoousios.
Wait, really? They used a word they had previously banned. Why was it condemned?
Well, it was condemned because a controversial theologian named Paul of Samosata had used it in a way that completely blurred the distinction between the Father and the Son.
Oh, okay.
To many Eastern bishops, homoousios sounded dangerously like Sabellianism or modalism.
That's a modalism.
It's the heretical idea that God is just one single person who occasionally switches out masks. So sometimes acting as the Father, sometimes acting as the Son. The Eastern bishops were terrified that saying the Father and Son shared the exact same substance meant they were literally the exact same person, completely destroying the distinct identity of Jesus.
It is genuinely wild. They resurrect a highly suspicious, previously condemned, non-biblical philosophical term because it is literally the only tool they have left to defeat Arius.
So there's a huge risk.
But they knew Arius could sign his name to any scriptural phrase. But his core philosophy would never allow him to sign a document claiming the creator and the creation shared the exact same uncreated essence.
It was the ultimate theological trap. And once the word was embedded in the creed, Constantine made his position clear. The debate was over.
The hammer comes down.
He demanded that every bishop sign the creed, and he backed that demand with the threat of immediate imperial exile. The velvet glove came off, and the iron fist of the state was revealed.
And under that immense pressure, almost everyone signs. Out of the 300-plus bishops, only Arius, his staunch defender Eusebius of Nicomedia, and 2 other loyal bishops refused to sign.
A very small minority.
They are immediately condemned as heretics, stripped of their positions, and banished by the emperor. The council also handles a few administrative issues, like standardizing the date of Easter so that all Christians celebrate it on the same Sunday, independent of the Jewish Passover calendar, further unifying the empire's new religious apparatus.
So, on paper, Constantine gets exactly what he wanted. He throws a massive, opulent feast to celebrate the conclusion of the council, hands out gifts, and sends the bishops home with official letters declaring that the Holy Spirit has spoken through their unified consensus.
If you close the history book right there, in the autumn of 325 AD, you'd think it was a massive, clean victory. The heretic is vanquished, the Orthodox faith is codified, and everyone lives happily ever after under a Christian emperor.
But before we dive into the profoundly messy aftermath that absolutely shatters that illusion of a clean victory, this is the perfect moment to pause and deal with the myths.
We have to.
Because the historical reality we just walked through, a highly technical, philosophically grueling debate over Neoplatonic definitions of substance resulting in the invention of homoousios, is not the story that lives in the modern public consciousness.
Not even close. If you mention the Council of Nicaea at a dinner party today, you are almost guaranteed to hear the Da Vinci Code version of events.
Oh, inevitably.
So let's tackle these directly. Dan Brown's book and the cultural osmosis that followed it famously claims that Constantine basically invented the divinity of Jesus at Nicaea. The narrative is that before 325 AD, Jesus was viewed strictly as a mortal prophet, a great human teacher, and that Constantine essentially held a rigged vote to turn him into a god so the emperor could consolidate patriarchal power.
This is one of the most easily disprovable myths in late antiquity.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty overwhelming.
The historical record demonstrates unequivocally that Christians had been worshiping Jesus as divine for centuries before Constantine was even born. We have the letters of Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, writing to the Emperor Trajan around 112 AD.
That's 200 years before Nicaea?
Exactly. And Pliny observes that local Christians gathered before dawn to sing hymns to Christ, quote, as to a god. The theological treatises of the 2nd and 3rd centuries are entirely focused on explaining the nature of Christ's divinity. The debate at Nicaea was not whether Jesus was divine. Both Alexander and Arius fervently agreed he was divine.
Right. The debate was about the hyperspecific philosophical mechanics of that divinity. Was he co-eternal with the Father, or was he a deeply exalted, pre-existent creation?
Which brings us to the second and perhaps most pervasive myth regarding Nicaea.
The Bible one.
Yes, the idea that this council is where the Bible was created. The story goes that Constantine and these elite bishops sat around a table in a smoky back room, reviewed dozens of Gospels, threw out all the texts that highlighted Jesus' humanity or elevated women, and arbitrarily selected the 4 Gospels we have today to exert control over the masses.
I hear this one constantly. But when you look at the actual surviving decrees, the canons, and the eyewitness accounts from the Council of Nicaea, the canon of Scripture is literally never mentioned.
Not once.
It wasn't on the agenda, they didn't vote on it, they didn't even debate it.
It is entirely absent from the historical record of the council. So this raises an important question. If it didn't happen, where on earth did this incredibly specific cultural memory come from? Why does everyone, from internet commenters to famous novelists, believe Nicaea created the Bible?
The origin of this conspiracy theory is honestly a fascinating study in how fake news operated before the internet. Our sources trace it back to a very specific document called the Synodicon Vetus.
Right, the Synodicon Vetus. It is a Greek manuscript from the late 9th century, so over 500 years after Nicaea. It purported to be a summary of all the early church councils.
Yeah.
And tucked into its account of Nicaea is this bizarre, clearly fabricated story.
What does it claim?
It claims that the bishops were overwhelmed by the sheer number of competing gospels and didn't know which ones were authentic.
So, according to this 9th century text, they take all the various books, place them on a table near the altar in the church, and pray for God to show them the truth. And miraculously, the spurious or fake books fall off the table onto the floor, while the true, canonical books remain on the table.
A literal magical sorting table.
That's crazy.
Now, this manuscript sat in absolute obscurity in Greece for centuries. It wasn't until the year 1601 that a scholar named John Papas brought it to Strasbourg, translated it, and published it.
Okay, so it gets printed.
And as this published version began to circulate among European intellectuals over the next century, it caught the attention of Enlightenment thinkers who were very eager to critique institutional religion.
Enter Voltaire.
Yes, Voltaire, the brilliant 18th century French philosopher and fierce critic of the church. He finds this obscure published account of the magical sorting table in a supplement about Nicaea.
He must have loved that.
He did. In his famous philosophical dictionary, Voltaire gleefully repeats the story of the books falling off the altar. He uses it to weaponize the absurdity against the church, sarcastically writing, "What a pity that so fine an ordeal has been lost."
So Voltaire takes this 9th century fairy tale, blasts it out to the intellectual elite of Europe to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the biblical canon. And over the next 2 centuries, authors and skeptics basically strip away the magical elements, the falling off the table, and replace it with a cynical political backroom deal orchestrated by Constantine.
What's fascinating here is analyzing why this myth possesses such incredible staying power in our culture. Why is this false narrative so much stickier than the historical truth?
Why do you think that is?
I suspect it's because it provides a neat, cinematic, easily digestible explanation for a process that was actually agonizingly slow, organic, and complex.
It's so much easier for us to believe in a grand conspiracy. You know, a room full of powerful men twirling their mustaches and making cynical choices. It's much easier to grasp than the boring reality of consensus building.
Exactly.
The actual biblical canon wasn't formed by an imperial decree in a weekend. It was recognized gradually, over hundreds of years, by disparate communities across the Roman Empire, slowly coming to an agreement on which texts reliably reflected the earliest apostolic teachings. But a 300-year organic consensus doesn't make for a good thriller novel.
No, it doesn't. A conspiracy theory gives us a villain. It gives us a definitive point of origin. But history is rarely that clean. And ironically, the actual documented history of what happened after the bishops left Nicaea is far more politically compromised, chaotic, and dramatic than anything Dan Brown could have invented.
Well, let's dive into that messy aftermath then. Because as we hinted earlier, Nicaea did not solve the Arian crisis. Arguably, the introduction of imperial force made the theological crisis vastly more destructive.
It absolutely exacerbated the conflict, because theological truth was now inextricably married to state power.
And state power is dangerous.
Especially in the late Roman Empire. It is inherently fickle and driven by pragmatism, not piety. Within just a few years of the council concluding, Constantine realizes that exiling Arius and removing the Arian bishops has not created the peace he desired.
The unrest continued.
Yeah, the eastern half of his empire is still heavily sympathetic to Arius, and the harsh imposition of Homoousios is causing ongoing political unrest.
And since Constantine's primary directive is imperial unity, not strict adherence to a Greek philosophical term, he basically backpedals.
He performs a massive political reversal. He recalls Eusebius of Nicomedia from exile, restoring him to power. He even invites Arius back to the imperial court.
Wow, just completely flips.
Yeah. Arius drafts a new, somewhat vague confession of faith that strategically skirts around the harsh Nicene wording, and Constantine accepts it. The emperor then orders the Orthodox Church to welcome Arius back into communion.
Which absolutely infuriates the hardline Nicene faction. By this time, the young deacon Athanasius has been elevated to Bishop of Alexandria. And Athanasius flat out refuses the emperor's order. He will not allow Arius back into his church.
And this is where the tragic irony of the imperial church is fully realized. Because Athanasius defies the emperor's demand for unity, Constantine turns the machinery of the state against the champion of Nicaea.
That is brutal.
Athanasius is deposed and exiled. In fact, over the course of his tumultuous life, Athanasius will be driven into exile 5 separate times by various emperors. He literally spends years hiding in the Egyptian desert with monks just to escape imperial arrest.
The whiplash is just dizzying. The emperor who forced everyone to sign the Nicene Creed ends up exiling the primary defender of that creed.
It really highlights the politics of it all.
And the crowning irony happens at the very end of Constantine's life. In 337 AD, as Constantine lays dying, he finally requests to be formally baptized. And the bishop who performs the baptism of the first Christian emperor, it is none other than Eusebius of Nicomedia,
The very Arian bishop who championed the heresy at Nicaea.
It is a stunning visual representation of how thoroughly Nicaea had failed to settle the issue. And the chaos only deepens after Constantine's death. The empire is eventually divided among his sons, and Constantius II takes control of the East. Constantius II was actively sympathetic to the Arian and semi-Arian theology.
So let's define semi-Arianism, because this highlights exactly how granular and intense this philosophical war became.
Okay.
The strict Nicene word was Homoousios, meaning the exact same substance. But the semi-Arians proposed a compromise word, Homoousios, meaning a similar substance.
Wait, they just added an I?
Yes, the entire theological destiny of the Roman Empire hinged on the addition of a single Greek letter, an iota.
Oh.
It's literally where we get the English idiom. It doesn't make one iota of difference. But to the theologians of the 4th century, that one letter was the absolute boundary between heaven and hell. To the semi-Arians, Homoousios was the perfect political compromise. It elevated Jesus far above a mere creature, but it avoided the terrifying Sabellian implications of saying he was the exact same substance as the Father.
So under Constantius II, this semi-Arian theology becomes the dominant state-sponsored force in the Eastern Roman Empire. The state apparatus is now actively persecuting the Nicene Christians.
This raises an important question about the legacy of Nicaea. The church initially went to the emperor to solve a spiritual problem. They allowed him to enforce theological truth with the sword.
And it backfired.
Tremendously. In doing so, they established a precedent that turned spiritual disagreements into political crimes. Whichever theological faction managed to secure the emperor's ear at any given moment was deemed orthodox, and they eagerly used the power of the Roman state to depose, exile, and persecute their theological rivals. The church had traded the blood of the martyrs for the coercive power of the state.
And this Arian dominance in the mid-4th century didn't just cause internal Roman drama. It had massive, world-altering historical consequences that rippled outward for centuries, right?
Immense consequences. During this specific window when Arianism held the imperial favor, Christian missionaries were pushing north beyond the borders of the empire to evangelize the Germanic tribes.
The tribes outside Rome.
Right? A bishop named Ulfilas, who was actually ordained by Eusebius of Nicomedia, translated the Bible into the Gothic language and converted massive populations of Goths and Vandals to Arian Christianity.
Oh, wow. So when the Western Roman Empire begins to collapse a century later, and these Germanic tribes sweep in to conquer territories in Italy, Spain, and North Africa,
you suddenly have conquering Germanic warlords who fiercely hold to Arian theology, ruling over conquered Roman populations who hold to Nicene theology. The theological debates sparked in Alexandria and poorly suppressed at Nicaea directly fuel the political, cultural, and military conflicts of the 5th and 6th centuries during the fall of Rome.
So if the 50 years after Nicaea were essentially an Arian hangover, how did the Nicene Creed ever survive? When did it actually become the finalized permanent standard of Orthodox Christianity?
It required another emperor to definitively turn the tide. It wasn't until the year 381 AD, under the reign of Emperor Theodosius.
Okay, another emperor.
Yes. Theodosius was a staunch, uncompromising Nicene Christian from the West. He convened the First Council of Constantinople. At this council, brilliant theologians known as the Cappadocian Fathers finally found the precise philosophical language distinguishing between one outheia or substance and three hypostases, or persons that alleviated the Eastern fears of modalism.
So they essentially updated the vocabulary to make Homoousios safe to use.
Exactly. The Council of Constantinople reaffirmed the original decision of Nicaea, expanded the creed to include a robust section on the Holy Spirit, which gives us the version most churches recite today. And Theodosius used the full, uncompromising power of the state to finally suppress Arianism within the borders of the empire.
And that was it.
Only then, over half a century after Nicaea, did Trinitarian Orthodoxy truly become the uncontested law of the Roman state.
It took over 50 years of bitter infighting, endless synods, multiple exiles, political maneuvering, and raw imperial coercion to make the decision of Nicaea actually stick. Nicaea wasn't the end of the debate at all. It was merely the chaotic opening salvo in a multi-generational war over the identity of Jesus and the soul of the Christian faith.
It is a history that should profoundly challenge everyone who engages with it. For modern believers, it forces a deeply uncomfortable reckoning with how messy, political, and human the preservation of orthodoxy truly was. The truth wasn't protected in a sterile vacuum. It was hammered out in the crucible of imperial politics. And for skeptics, it demands a much more rigorous and nuanced understanding of history, moving past childish, Dan Brown-style conspiracy theories to recognize the genuine, complex philosophical stakes that drove these people.
We started today by talking about how major historical turning points are usually imagined as battlefields. But the Battle of Nicaea was fought with highly technical Greek words inside a marble palace overseen by a military dictator. The scars those bishops brought into that room were inflicted by the Roman Empire, yet by the time the century was over, the church was utilizing the machinery of that exact same empire to inflict exile and suffering upon each other over a single vow.
I would ask everyone listening to reflect on what it truly means when an idea becomes deeply institutionalized. How does a movement fundamentally change its character when it stops being a grassroots rebellion surviving in the shadows and starts being the law of the land, enforced by the sword of the state?
That is the pivotal question at the heart of all this. The shift from a persecuted supernova to an imperial monolith altered the DNA of Western civilization forever. So I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to ponder on your own. Imagine an alternate history.
Okay.
If the Roman Empire had never legalized Christianity, if Constantine had never experienced his vision at the Milvian Bridge, never called the Council of Nicaea, and the church had been forced to remain an illegal, underground, decentralized supernova, what would have happened?
A heavy thought.
Would Christianity have eventually fractured into hundreds of entirely different, completely separate religions, slowly lost to the sands of history? Or would that resilient, suffering community of believers have somehow found a way to organically agree on who Jesus was on their own timeline, without the heavy, coercive threat of imperial exile hanging over their head?
A fascinating what-if, and one that cuts to the core of how power interacts with belief.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the myths, and we will see you next time.